Today's scripture reading is from the book of Colossians in the New Testament, chapter 3, verses 1 through 14. Since then you have been raised with Christ. Set your hearts on things above where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. For you died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory. Put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature: sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry. Because of these, the wrath of God is coming. You used to walk in these ways in the life you once lived, but now you must also rid yourselves of all such things as these: anger, rage, malice, slander, and filthy language from your lips.
Do not lie to each other, since you have taken off your old self with its practices and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge in the image of its creator. Here there is no Gentile or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave or free, but Christ is all and is in all. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with each other and forgive one another if any of you has a grievance against someone. Forgive as the Lord forgave you, and over all these virtues put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. This is God's word.
Good morning. Thank you for fighting the traffic and the road closures on Marathon Sunday. Actually, it's a little bit of a sore subject, Marathon Sunday, because when Leo asked me a couple months ago if I could fill in, he didn't even think to ask if I might be running, if I might be training. He took one look at me and he was like, "You're free on Marathon Sunday, right?" So it's a little bit of a sore subject. No, in all honesty, it's a real honor to be back up here. It's a real honor to get to share from God's Word. A really important passage, one that I've been thinking about obviously a lot this week. And I want to start by asking a question. I wonder how those New Year's resolutions are coming. Ryan mentioned one that he has challenged himself to consider. Maybe even asking that question, it actually raises a lot of feelings, because I've talked to people this week about this. Some people are really passionate about New Year's resolutions, and rightfully so, because it's an opportunity to turn over a new leaf. Some people are actually pretty salty, pretty cynical, right? They can kind of be dismissive of even the idea of a New Year's resolution. I don't know that either of those responses are fully right, but I was even talking to a friend who said, I was thinking about buying a Peloton, and he said, wait till the end of January, the secondary market will be flooded with exercise equipment, really cheap, because by the end of the first month of the year, right, people are starting to realize how unrealistic the goals they put upon themselves can be. And so the reason I actually start this way this morning is because I think Paul is giving us a sort of a way to think about the language of resolutions and resoluteness. He's trying to kind of counter some prevailing narratives that were true in his day as in our day. And there's two real narratives that I think he's addressing for us this morning. One is a kind of secular cultural narrative. This is the narrative of self-improvement plans and self-improvement regimens. It's often a very isolating and autonomous sort of journey that you are on by yourself. It's characterized by phrases like, you're trying to find your truth or trying to be the best version of yourself. It can be, unfortunately, very self-involved and self-important. But he's also, and I think more vocally, addressing a sort of religious, moralizing kind of narrative of self-improvement that's built around rites and rituals and rules and regulations. It's a lot of R's. But it's built around this idea that you have to follow a certain number of rules to be acceptable before God. And I think he's actually more vocally dismissive of that. But those are the two narratives that I think he's kind of countering and sort of building a picture that could be different. And he's giving us something that looks a little bit more holistic. And what I mean is, he realizes that both of those narratives, they treat actions, but not the heart. They treat symptoms, but not the causes. This is the third message in a series we're doing here at City Church called 2020 Vision. It's our attempt as a community to understand who we are and what we are, not only within ourselves, but also for the world in which we traffic, also for the communities that we live in and day out in this city. It's an opportunity for us to reflect and think, what does it mean that we are a community of love and devoted to that love, not only for each other, but also for our city and our world? Last week, we saw a really incredible story of a woman who ran to the feet of Jesus and poured out perfume in a way that was actually socially disruptive. She was so devoted to love that people in the room were kind of freaked out, like, what is going on? And so I think this week we're going to see an extension of that, but also potentially a reversal of that. This morning we're going to see how love can actually reconstruct and heal social structures, how the collective fabric can be woven back together when we have in our mind the right view of love and what it means for us. I think maybe the best characterization of this is, in my opinion, maybe the best or the brightest contemporary philosopher, living philosopher, a guy named Bill Watterson. That name doesn't ring a bell. He's the author of the comic strip Calvin and Hobbes. And this is a strip from Calvin and Hobbes. It's a really amazing, succinct version of what I'm talking about. Calvin asks Hobbes, do you think our morality is defined by our actions or what's in our hearts? And Hobbes, sagely, in the only the way a stuffed animal can, says, I think our actions show what's in our hearts. In the third panel, Calvin's processing this. And by the fourth panel, he says, I resent that. And that's funny because Calvin realizes there's a disconnect between what's in his heart, who he wants himself to be, and the way he exists out in the world. And I wonder if you, like me, sometimes feel not only that I resent that, but I resemble that, right? That I wake up and I try to get centered and I try to meditate, I try to think about my day and who I am, and the second I hit Houston traffic, it's gone, right? And so then I start to think, is that what's really in my heart? Which version of myself am I really? The version that I wake up, look in the mirror and give myself a pep talk, or the version that under duress and under stress becomes something else entirely? And so I think what the comic strip is suggesting is what Paul is suggesting first, which is this. I don't believe, and I don't believe Paul believes, that the right philosophy or ethic leads to a renewed heart. It's the other way around. A renewed heart reformulates our philosophy of the world and our place in it. It starts there and moves out, not out and moves in. And so this morning, I'm just going to follow Paul really closely. I'm going to move kind of slowly because I think he's moving very quickly. And I'm just going to talk about a few things that I really see as major thematic interests. I'm going to talk about the old self. What is this? The new self. What or who is this? And then how we can hold all the transformations together by putting on love. So first, the old self. To really understand what the old self is, according to Paul, we have to back up to Colossians 2. At the end of Colossians 2, he says these words: since you died with Christ to the elemental spiritual forces of this world, why, as though you still belong to the world, do you submit to its rules? Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. Such regulations indeed have an appearance of wisdom with their self-imposed worship, their false humility, and their harsh treatment of the body, but they lack any value in restraining sensual indulgence. So just on a very intuitive, basic level, isn't this kind of true of a lot of sort of self-help plans and sort of diets that, like, the more extreme and the more harsh and the more sort of ascetic they are, the harder it is to maintain them and the more shame we feel, and it can often be a sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's like, oh man, like, I made it 27 out of the 30 days of Whole 30. I guess I have to start over. I'm not good enough. But I actually want to point out that he's addressing a real familiar and pernicious teaching of the day. It was a Gnostic teaching that said this. It said, the body is inherently evil. Our matter, our flesh is just tainted beyond recognition. And so therefore, Christ couldn't have come in bodily form because the body is just a problem. So what it is Christ came down and he looked like a human, he appeared like a human, but he wasn't really a body. And Paul is adamant, even in Colossians 2:9, he says Christ came in bodily form. Paul is adamant that Christ was a real flesh and blood person. And I even think he's playing a little bit of a word game here, because the teaching was called docetism or docetism. It comes from the Greek dokein, which means to appear or seem. So they said Christ appeared like a man, but he wasn't. Well, he says these teachings have what? The appearance of wisdom. He's sort of poking fun, right? He's saying, oh yeah, it looks right on the surface, but underneath, if you dive down, these are only treating symptoms, they're not treating causes. Do not touch, do not eat. Do not do this, do not do that. Those have the appearance of wisdom, they sound right, but they're only treating symptoms, not causes. And so he wants to kind of get to the heart of the matter, and the way he does this is by outlining two things that the old self is. They're defined by two things: individual idolatry and collective cacophony, collective discord. First, individual idolatry. Let's turn to Colossians 3, 5 through 7. He says these words, "Put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature, sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry. Because of these, the wrath of God is coming. You used to walk in these ways in the life you once lived." I got real tied up. I'm an English teacher, and grammar and syntax are very important to me, and usually to no one else. But I got real tied up with which is idolatry. I started thinking about this. I said, is that phrase, is that little 3-word phrase, is it just referring to the last item on the list, greed? Or is there a way to read it, as I want to suggest this morning, that the entire list is saying this is idolatry? All of these are idols. Tim Keller says, the contemporary pastor Tim Keller says that sometimes, often, an idol is when we turn a good thing into an ultimate thing. So if you read through this list, there is nothing inherently wrong about our bodies. There's nothing inherently wrong about our sexuality. There's nothing inherently wrong about having desires and passions. It's when they become our ultimate goal and our ultimate desire that they become idols and they become functional gods for us. And so he's saying all of these idols are going to get in the way of treating the heart of the matter because they are taking up room in your heart. Our heart, as the reformer John Calvin said, are idol factories. If they're not filled with God, we will find ways to replace the space with something else that we make, that we love, that we treasure. But just as soon as Paul outlines this, he moves on. He moves really quickly in this chapter, in my opinion. And I think he moves on for a reason I'm going to hold off and tell you later. But he moves into the communal aspect of this. We read about the idolatry of the individual heart, but then he's very, very interested in what that idolatry does to the community, because as tragic as it is that it might sort of disrupt the individual heart, it's actually more tragic what idolatry can do to us as a culture. And so in Colossians 3, 8 through 10, "But now you must also rid yourselves of all such things as these: anger, rage, malice, slander, and filthy language from your lips. Do not lie to each other, since you have taken off your old self with its practices and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge in the image of its creator." So the first list are things that happen to us individually on a personal level. This second list is what happens in a communal way. We start to be filled with anger and rage toward others. We start to lie to one another. We start to make the idol of our heart the defining characteristic of our community, and in so doing, we lose track of what a community is supposed to be. We actually flip the structure of what the Latin is imago Dei, which means that we are made in the image of God. We are made in the image of God, and what we do is we flip it because we make God in our own image, and everything else is underneath of us. Everything that gets in the way of satisfying the God that we make in our own image is collateral. And so a really easy example, a very lazy example, because I couldn't think of one better, would be if you're up for a promotion at work, and the God in your life is your success and your well-being, then it actually makes perfect sense to lie and slander and do anything in your power to serve the end of that God. It makes perfect sense, but it makes tragic sense, I think. And so what happens is we flip the structure. Instead of believing that we're made in the image of God, we make God in our image. And and it leads to a really tragic conclusion. I love the way Anne Lamott puts this. She says, you can safely assume that you've created God in your own image when it turns out that God hates all the same people you do, right? You've maybe seen this at City Church before, but underneath this is a critique of the idea of making God in our own image. If you've made God in your own image, then everyone else around you, you'll surround yourself with people who don't threaten that sense of identity. You'll surround yourself with people who won't threaten your idols. And in so doing, you'll remove yourself from the community of faith where we should be holding each other accountable and pushing each other to understand the idols of our heart and why the only satisfactory love to put in our heart is the love of God and the love of Christ. The sad thing about the old self, and this is sort of a takeaway, I think, is that the old self is full of passions, but it's lacking in love. Now, if you're new to City Church or you don't know what you believe, I am not saying, and I want to be very clear about this, that the world outside of the walls of the church, wherever that is, doesn't understand love. I'm not saying that. Love is a powerful emotion. There are often, I've found that people who are not involved in church or religious communities sometimes understand how to love one another better than I do and better than we do. I'm not dismissing that idea. What I'm saying is that when we're filled with passions and desires that ultimately aren't directed toward the love of our Father, they leave us feeling hungrier and thirstier and more unsatisfied than we can imagine. It reminds me, again, I'm an English teacher, of a poem. It reminds me of a famous poem by Samuel Taylor Coleridge called The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which is about an ancient mariner stranded out to sea with his fellow sailors, and he looks out on the water. They're drifting, they're lost, they're thirsty. And you've heard this before probably. He looks out in the ocean and he says, water, water everywhere, nor any drop to drink. You might have heard the modern version, and not a drop to drink. I wonder if we feel like that in our life, that we see the potential for love in every pocket and corner. We look out at the ocean of our existence and we say, there's so many opportunities to love and be loved, but why do I still feel thirsty? Why am I not satisfied? And that's what leads us to the new self. That's what leads us to the new self. So if the old self is defined by individual idolatry and collective cacophony, the new self is defined by individual renewal and collective healing. So I want to pick up right where we left off, Colossians 3, 9 through 10. Do not lie to each other, since you have taken off your old self with its practices and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge in the image of its creator. This is a strange sentence. You may not notice at first. It's a really strange sentence. Do not lie to each other is the first subject, the first object that we're thinking about. But then it's contrasted, if you read it out, to the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge. So the opposition is between lying and knowledge. If you're reading this quickly, you might expect the opposition would be between lying and truthfulness. Or if the sentence started with knowledge, you would assume that the opposite of that would be ignorance. Paul is doing something really, I think, astounding and really interesting by making this unexpected contrast between lying and knowledge. And I think he's doing it for a couple of reasons. One, if he said the new self is defined by truthfulness, he'd be falling into the same trap that he already dismissed in Colossians 2, which is he's treating a symptom, not a cause. It's not just that we're truthful. We have to understand why it's important to be truthful. We have to be taught why truthfulness even matters again. And that's because of knowledge. It's because in the knowledge of God is the reordering of our heart that is necessary to find truthfulness important and worth defending. And it actually, if you spell it out, it actually makes even intuitive sense. And what I mean is this: if you know God, according to the Bible, if you know God, then you trust God. If you trust God, that means you are handing over your life to him because you believe that he has your best interest at heart and will work all things together for your good. If those three things are true, then there is no need to lie and slander, to turn to rage and malice, to secure a future that you believe is outside your control. It is outside your control, but for your good. And so knowledge is actually the key to the personal renewal, the individual renewal of the new self. But again, Paul moves really quickly. He's not going to belabor the point about the self. He's not actually that interested in the self. He's interested in what it means for the world we live in. And so he moves on to Colossians 3:11, where he says these incredible words. Here there is no Gentile or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave or free, but Christ is all and is in all. The new self that is being renewed in the image of its creator will be better equipped to see the image of its creator in others. If you are in the process of understanding, wow, I believe I'm made in God's image, then everyone you see is also on that same journey, and it gives you a common tongue, a commonality that no one else has. And so if you don't see that, if you don't look out and see others made in the image of God, then there's a problem, there's a disconnect with the self. This is a really complicated passage, actually, this one sentence. It's relatively difficult. I've actually heard it used in ways I think are unhelpful. One of those ways, to be frank, is that some people read Colossians 3:11 and they say, oh, this is about an erasure of our individual identities. In Christ is all, so therefore there is no longer any concept of the individual, it's all collective. And I actually think that's dangerous for a number of reasons. One, just very, very basically, if we're all made in God's image, then we reflect the diversity of God's character. So to erase or have some kind of collective amnesia about our pasts and our differences actually is putting a governor on God's creativity. It's saying, oh, actually, God, we can take it from here. We're all going to be the same. And if he had wanted to do that, he would do that. Also, on a rhetorical level, if Paul wanted us to not think about our differences, why would he write about them, right? He's writing to the Colossians just on a sort of writing level, on a sentence structure. He's reminding them of those differences. So this is not, I think, what in contemporary culture we would refer to as kind of a color blindness. It's not saying that it's an erasure or an amnesia of all our differences. However, it is also, in my opinion, not saying that those differences define us in the new community founded in Christ's love. So it actually frees us to celebrate our differences, our ideological inheritances, our different pasts, our histories, even the diversity of our character, which is bound up in concepts, again, like race or class or creed or whatever it might be. These are concepts that are worth thinking about, and they're worth defending, and they're worth understanding. But whatever identity we bring to our new community cannot be the defining characteristic of that community. I can't look across the table and say, well, I'm a Gentile and you're a Jew, or I'm a Scythian and you're a barbarian. If that is the way that we're thinking about community as our differences, then it will collapse. But if we're able to recuperate and restore and heal the gaps in between those differences so that we can then again celebrate the diversity of God's character, then that is the collective healing I think we all seek. I think what Paul is saying is this. The litmus test, the way you know if you're a new self, is not only a renewal of the individual mind in knowledge. Perhaps it's more important that you are witnessing some sort of renewal in the world around you, in the community you're living in. And the reason I say that is because we are really good at lying to ourselves. We can wake up every morning and say, I'm a new self, I'm a new self, I'm a new self. And we can even convince ourselves as we go about the day, like, oh, the old Clint would have done this in traffic. I won't say what. The new Clint, no, he wouldn't do that. That's just symptom language. That's just talking about symptoms. If it's invested and it's internalized on a heart level that reorients our desires, then our community will look differently and we will behave differently in that community. And it will reflect the character and image of the God we worship. But Paul is not naive. I think he realizes how hard this is going to be to pull off. And maybe even some of the words I've said this morning, maybe you hear it and you're thinking, I'm not sure I agree with that, and maybe I need to talk to Clint about that. Paul already accounts for this. As a writer, as a thinker, he's saying, I know that what I'm saying is hard, And I know that we're all working together to figure it out. So he turns in Colossians 3:12 to the way to negotiate these transformations. It's going to be painful at times, but here's what you do. As God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with each other and forgive one another if any of you has a grievance against someone. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. And over all these virtues, put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. If Paul thought that a light switch was going to go on and we were going to be new and we were never going to have to forgive one another again, then he wouldn't write any of this. He knows the pain of transformation. But he also knows the pain that many of us feel today and that I think people felt throughout time, that sometimes it feels like we're putting on costume after costume. It feels like we have all these different selves, right? You may realize that this is from the wildly popular series, Friends. This character, in response to having all his clothes hidden, puts on all of his roommates' clothes. And he says, "Could I be wearing any more clothes?" And I sometimes feel like this. I sometimes feel like I've got like a work self and a Houston driving self and a sort of church self and a family self, and then even like a wider family self. I have different versions of family self, right? And it gets so tiring and I get so lost. Another good example would be if you've seen Mrs. Doubtfire, where Robin Williams has to be at a work dinner and a family dinner at the same restaurant at the same time, and he's changing in and out of costumes and he forgets who he is. Like, that's how I feel sometimes. Who am I underneath it all? And that's why it's so important that we clothe ourselves, that we wrap ourselves in love, because that essential identity is what will bind everything together. That's what Paul's saying. It's not to say that we don't adapt and adjust in different contexts. It's not to say that there's a difference between different selves. It's just to say that underneath it all is the clothing of love. And I have to point out the word there, binds, the Greek sundesmos, can be translated ligament, band, or bondage. It's a heavy word. Paul is saying you have to be in bondage to love to transform. And the reason that is bearable and not a form of slavery is because we are in bondage to love, and as 1 John tells us, God is love. So in clothing ourselves in love, we are actually clothing ourselves in Christ Jesus. A warning as we move toward the conclusion. I also realized as I was thinking this week that I've seen people take pride in this kind of love. I've seen the danger of actually turning love itself into an idol. Maybe if you are someone who, again, is new to church or checking out church, maybe it's a New Year's resolution. Maybe you've witnessed the way Christians can be kind of arrogant about the kind of love that should define our community. And it reminded me of a 20th century philosopher and theologian, Denis de Rougemont, who said, "Love ceases to be a demon only when he ceases to be a god." Love ceases to be a demon only when he ceases to be a God. And how fortunate are we that we worship a God who accounted for this? Because we will turn love into a lowercase g God if not for the work of a uppercase G God who would become love for us in the form of Christ and his sacrificial love on our behalf. To put on love is to put on Christ. And to put on Christ is to begin the process of healing. Real love is bondage to that idea. True capital L love is bondage to that ideal. Real love is binding. And it reminded me also of Martin Luther King Jr., who said these words, "I've decided to stick to love. Hate is too great a burden to bear." He said so many powerful and profound things that sometimes quotes like this get lost in the shuffle. It is actually a deeply theological and philosophical statement, because Martin Luther King is drawing on the tradition of Paul and saying, love first stuck to us, and so it is now our obligation to stick to love. It is the lighter of the two burdens. as we conclude this morning, I mentioned earlier Samuel Taylor Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which is a romantic poem. And I mentioned that the mariners were adrift, lost at sea, and the reason they were lost at sea was because the sailor, had shot an albatross, a bird. And the sailors believed that to be bad luck, so they forced him to wear the bird around his neck. He calls it a cross. And so he's an old self living with his mistakes and the mistakes of his past, and he's surrounded by an old community that is instituting rules and regulations to remind himself of his shame. I wonder if you've felt that before. And the poem has a really beautiful conclusion. Spoiler alert. Here's how it ends. He finds his way back to land. And what does he find when he gets to land? A church. And what's happening at the church? A wedding has just gotten out. And a wedding guest is leaving, and the mariner decides, I have to offer this young person some advice. And he says these words: "He prayeth best who loveth best, all things both great and small. For the dear God who loveth us, he made and loveth all." This is Colossians 3. This is Colossians 3. Don't worry about how to be a better prayer. Worry about how to reorient your love, because the prayer will flow from that. Don't treat the symptom, treat the cause. And how do we treat the cause? By knowing that God made all of us in his image and loves us to the extent that we are made in his image and redeemed in the work of Christ. This is a summary of Colossians 3. And so if this morning you feel like you're in an old pattern, or if you feel like you're finding new patterns, or as is more often the case, you feel like you're in a period in your life of transition from the old to the new, and you're taking on the pain of that transformation and everything it demands of you, I want to end on a liberating, I hope a liberating note about what it means to be devoted to love. Because this morning I've hopefully not been dismissive of some of the sort of self-help rhetoric in our culture. Some of it can be really valuable and really useful. And some of it can actually lead to real transformation. But if you feel, as I sometimes feel, that there are so many 5-step or 9-step or 14-step programs that sometimes feel like pyramid schemes and sometimes feel like just a new self to try on to see if maybe for once or for the last time I can change, I want to show how Paul's offering something different for us. And even as I say that, I'll offer one final word, a little bit tongue-in-cheek, that maybe even Christianity can be said to be a step-by-step program, but in a radically different way. It can be a step-by-step program because there were many steps taken on our behalf by Jesus Christ himself as he took a cross outside the walls of Jerusalem and was crucified on a cursed place called Golgotha, where he completed the work that we couldn't even begin. Those are steps worth following. Please pray with me. Dear Heavenly Father, I find that January can be a difficult month for many, whether it's we're trying to find new patterns or we're reminded of the old patterns that just have never left our life. That it can be hard to know how to be a new self. And Paul this morning, he didn't tell us how to become a new self. It was the given condition of the passage. It is that Christ's love makes us a new self. And then it is up to us to know how to take on that newness and how to become one with his love and one with his people. I pray that whether we are the resolution-forming kind of people or not, that we will be resolved in following you, resolved in the work of your Son, who clothes us in the righteousness that he earned and we did not. And I pray all these things in his name. Amen.